You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. In this discussion, we're talking about the use of civilian drones. Unmanned aircraft or drones have gained notoriety, especially in recent and current conflicts in Afghanistan and Somalia, where remotely operated aircraft have been used for surveillance and airstrikes. But that same technology is now being used for civilian purposes. In Britain, Merseyside police are already using the first remote-controlled helicopter fitted with cameras. They say its main purpose is to tackle antisocial behaviour and public disorder. Merseyside's Assistant Chief Constable says the drones help put more officers on the streets, and maximising technology is a powerful way of achieving this. A new report by the UK's Aerospace, Aviation and Defence Knowledge Transfer Network has attempted to analyse the way drones will transform society in future, including for crop or wildlife monitoring and jobs like checking railway lines. But what do they look like? The one being used by Merseyside police is 1 metre wide and weighs less than a bag of sugar. But civil liberties groups are concerned about how the technology could be developed, and they say they're worried about an invasion of privacy. Joining me for a discussion on the civilian use of drones is Stephen Harris, senior reporter for the Engineer magazine. Harry Rogers is a local peace activist from Wales, and Robert Dewar is Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at New York University and President of Adacor, who provides software for commercial aviation and defence companies. So let's begin with Stephen Harris, senior reporter for the Engineer magazine. Stephen, should we be using drones in the UK?
I think drones for civilian purposes have a huge potential to make quite a contribution to society in all sorts of different areas. But I think we need to be really careful with regards to regulation and oversight to make sure that they're not misused, and also to ensure that they're safe.
And Robert Dewar.
Right. My main concern, there are obviously a whole range of concerns, but my main focus and concern has been on safety. These things are potentially quite risky and in the current situation not sufficiently well regulated, in my opinion. So that's my focus. Is I think if we do deploy these things, especially they're liable to be employed in high population areas, there's a real potential for safety issues, and so that's been my concern all along.
And Harry Rogers.
Safety is an issue, of course, and where I live in West Wales, they're currently testing the Watchkeeper drone. It's a government drone that's being tested up on the airfield in Cardigan. I mean, they've already had accidents with that testing that drone, where one has crashed into the runway, another one actually crashed into the road outside the airfield. And hit a parked car. Luckily, there was nobody around there. But
aside from the safety issues, Harry, do you think that we should be using them for their other purposes in the UK?
There are a number of purposes to which they're going to be used, to which I would object, and these are civilian purposes. There are, of course, when they carried out the consultation process for setting up drone testing in West Wales, in Aberfoyle, they used this argument about the civilian uses of drones, and talked about the way in which it would do wonderful things for agriculture, marvellous things for shipping, so that they would be able to track things that they haven't been able to do in the past because of bad weather, and also they could use drones in situations where it would be dangerous to put a piloted.
Well, that all sounds great then. What on earth could be wrong with that, Harry?
That all sounds great, and there's nothing wrong with that. But the civilian uses to which I object are the ones to do with surveillance, infringing on civil liberties in society, and also the fact that they're starting to investigate using artificial intelligence in unmanned aerial vehicles for transporting vehicles for planes, particularly from one place to another with no pilot whatever in them. And the Australia project, which was funded partly by the major military companies and partly by the National Assembly for Wales, is an example of that, where they've been doing extensive work on that.
Well, let's go to Stephen Harris. He's a senior reporter for the Engineer magazine. Stephen, we've obviously heard the surveillance aspect with the use of drones. We already know that it's being used in warfare, and we know that Merseyside police have been using it to tackle on antisocial behaviour. But how else can we be using these drones?
There's a huge range of potential uses for drones. I mean, think of some really things that most people would agree would be positive uses. In environmentalism, for example, they can be used for a huge range of purposes with regards to gathering data to monitor climate change, to make sure rainforests are being protected, to watch over protective wildlife species. You can go into all sorts of dangerous areas that you wouldn't be able to easily send a human, like in the Arctic or even in volcanoes, for example, potentially. They're also environmental groups using them to kind of track polluters, and one example is a group that tracked Japanese whaling ships in the Pacific. So there's a huge potential uses there. And also in things like disaster relief. In Haiti, they flew drones over the island to kind of try and assess some of the damage, to try and plan infrastructure recovery. And in search and rescue as well, you could even have drones that sort of seek out people in buildings that potentially are in danger of collapsing or have been attacked, or people lost at sea could sort of fly over the water and search for people.
Professor Dewar, obviously, aside from the safety concerns that you have, these drones are a powerful technology that we should be utilising, isn't it?
Oh yes, I think that's certainly true. I mean, the real concern, I think, here is that they are planes flying around in the sky, and we're actually pretty good at making planes reliable, at least from a software point of view, and the general view of the FAA in the US and the CAA in England has been that the software should be treated with the same care and respect as we treat software in aircraft of all types. And I think that's a reasonable point of view, but there's an easy rush to get these things into the air without that kind of care. We don't really have good analyses of these many accidents with drones, of whether they're software, whether they're hardware, whether they're preventable, what should have been done. We don't investigate these crashes like we do crashes of planes. And I think it's really important to take the view. After all, once these things are in the air, there's a lot of potential for safety issues. They can crash into other planes. They can certainly crash into people, buildings, and cause a lot of havoc. I mean, obviously, there's a big debate about the range of appropriate uses, and we've heard a good list here of uses which seem definitely positive, and I think there'll be a consensus on the use. We know there's a big debate, and it will be an ongoing debate over their use in surveillance. I mean, the whole issue of surveillance, especially in the UK.
Well, let's go to Harry Rogers and hear some of his concerns, because Harry, you've already outlined some of your surveillance concerns, but interestingly, what are your concerns with the invasion of privacy here?
Well, noise is a big issue for a start, and in West Wales, where they are carrying out testing even as we speak. I was up there last week doing an interview for a television programme, and there was a drone flying around while we were there, and the noise was absolutely incredible. And everybody who I know who lives around the Cardigan area are incensed by the amount of noise that drones actually make when they're in the air, when they're out in their gardens, during the day, during their weekends. It's incredible. It's a high-pitched whining noise that drives people to distraction. So that's one issue. The other issues, of course, are that they're testing the Watchkeeper, which is mainly a surveillance drone anyway. They're actually carrying out tests on getting their equipment, their camera equipment working properly, and they're using that on civilian populations within the testing area.
What on earth's wrong with that, though, Harry?
Well, people don't actually like to be filmed carrying out their activities in their garden, do they? I wouldn't. Would you?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. Joining me for a discussion on the civilian use of drones is Stephen Harris, senior reporter for the Engineer magazine. Harry Rogers is a local peace activist from Wales. And Robert Dewar is Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at New York University and President of Adacor, who provides software for commercial aviation and defence companies. So your concern is that they're going to be used over people in their garden, as opposed to, as they've already been used by Merseyside police to tackle antisocial behaviour and to hover over people on a Friday night to make sure and help lower crime.
Well, the arguments for and against the use in terms of police forces is highly debatable. Mm-hmm. It's very interesting that when you look at the fairs that have taken place up at Park Aberporth over the last few years, where different commercial and public bodies have come along to look at the future uses of drones, that the vast majority of people that have turned up to those events have been police forces. Now, I'm not objecting to them being used, providing that there is adequate there's adequate investigation and checking that they're being used properly.
Sure. Stephen Harris, senior reporter for the Engineer magazine. There is this concern that with surveillance does come indiscriminate monitoring of locals and of the public. As Harry just said, he doesn't want to be watched while he's in the garden.
No, I don't think anyone does. I think Harry's got it right there, that there is potential use for these, perhaps even in some surveillance applications. For example, you could have a police UAV, UAV being another name for a drone, monitoring a large crowd of people, perhaps at a football match, and they might be able to start to spot if there was overcrowding in a particular area or perhaps some violence taking place, and the police could direct their resources, their officers on the ground to go to that area. But then it does become more of an issue when you're talking about filming people's faces, filming people, spying on people, watching people. And I think Harry's right there, where we talk about it's not the technology itself that's the problem. It's the need to there to be sufficient oversight and regulation to make sure it's not misused.
Robert Dewar, do you share those concerns that you've just heard?
Oh yes, I certainly do. I mean, it's a long discussion how much surveillance you tolerate, and I think no one would tolerate, for instance, the police putting surveillance cameras inside people's homes. But if you have surveillance drones buzzing around and looking in windows, that's pretty close equivalent. And so I think if drones aren't carefully monitored, they really add a whole extra dimension to the concerns of excessive surveillance. But
this is just adapting. The police say this is just adapting the similar technology that they've already got on vans, on helicopters, and the CCTV we see on lampposts on every street corner.
Right, but these things are progressive, and drones potentially have far more potential for penetrating privacy than CCTVs on cameras in public places. I mean, I think everyone, the UK has an unusually high tolerance for public surveillance, but when that begins to cross the line into private surveillance of people in their homes, in their gardens, in what circumstances that they would normally consider private, that's probably for many people crossing the line, and I think we have to be careful. And we certainly need a sort of widespread public debate on what people are comfortable with, and in terms of the balance between preventing crime and invasion of privacy. This is always a delicate balance.
There's another issue here which I think it's quite easy to overlook, which is that we kind of assume that the dangers of surveillance come from the state, and police forces and other authorities spy on us. With UAVs, there's actually a danger as well that people could be spying on each other, because UAVs, they're not something that is solely held by military or big technology firms. These are things that people are making in their homes now. It's actually very easy, if you know how, to get some quite relatively basic software and use that to adapt a remote control plane. And there are tens of thousands of people in the US, particularly. There's a whole community who are building their own UAVs, and you equip that technology with a smartphone, say, and you have your own mobile flying video camera that you could send anywhere. Now, again, it could be used for good purposes, or it could be used to spy on people and for negative things, and that's why it's really important to that we have the debate and we formulate the correct regulation.
Because that's interesting. At the moment, current laws in the UK say that you can fly your own drone. It is still possible for people to roll it out as much as America.
At low altitude.
And obviously at a certain weight and a certain size. The director of the aerospace KTN, they launched this new report attempting to capture and analyse the future use of drones, but she said there's not going to be any new regulations and they'll comply with the regulations in place. Do you think there needs to be a new level of regulation?
I think we certainly need to look at it because of this issue that anyone could be able to build a drone. You can order parts off the internet. Once we get to the point where we have technology that enables you to actually build these things in your own home, not even from kits, but essentially printing out complicated parts and putting them together, and people can write their own software and they can develop these things themselves. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's always about how do we use the technology and how do we make sure it's not misused.
Harry Rogers, there seems to be this concern, as Robert Dewar said, that the UK public seem to accept a very high level of CCTV. But do you agree that there's a presumption that it's fine for someone to always be watching you, and these drones exacerbate that concern?
I don't agree with that at all. I think that there are large numbers of people in the UK who don't like the idea of CCTV surveillance, whether it's on lampposts or it's in the drone. It's still CCTV, whichever way you look at it. And the issue that really I think needs to be looked at in terms of regulation is this whole issue of including artificial intelligence into drones, where drones can start taking decisions about taking actions.
But that's not going to be a decision which they can decide when they're up and about where they want to go and what they want to do. These will be pre-programmed decisions. It will have its own level of self-determinism, but it won't be able to make any irrational decision, will it?
Do you know that? How do you know that?
Stephen Harris?
It's quite.
I'd say that.
You say that, but everybody's computer gets a bug sometimes. Right? Your own computer at home will get a bug in the software occasionally, and to actually argue that you're never ever going to have a situation where you don't get a bug in software in a vehicle that's flying around in the sky that's capable of taking its own decisions.
Well, there's two
issues. Really frightening.
I think there's two issues. Robert Dewar, actually, as Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at New York University, are these drones able to make their own decisions, but not irrational decisions? These will be pre-programmed ones.
Part of the trouble with modern artificial intelligence, typically it's statistically based, is you don't really know what it's going to do in advance. I mean, and it's awfully tempting to program AI systems with statistical models that look for trouble. And that's perfectly within technology, to feed them. You feed in a big statistical model which says this is a troublesome situation, this isn't, this isn't, and eventually you build a big Bayesian statistical model, and it's very tempting and perfectly within the available technology to have drones that go hunting for things that look suspicious on their own. And I would think that for those who, favor a high level of surveillance, that's an obvious step and one that we do need to be concerned about.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Daniel Sinner. Joining me for a discussion on the civilian use of drones is Stephen Harris, senior reporter for The Engineer magazine. Harry Rogers is a local peace activist from Wales. And Robert Dewar is Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at New York University and President of Adacor, who provides software for commercial aviation and defence companies. Do you think there should be new regulations to govern the use of these drones?
I would think so. I mean, I think we suffer in general from this society of technology running ahead of regulations, ahead of laws, and so on. You know, a policeman right now can't stand in the air looking in your fifth floor window and getting high-resolution images of everything that's inside your house. I think someone needs to consider whether that's an appropriate level of surveillance. It's technically easy to accomplish with drones.
Let's go back to Stephen Harris, who wanted to come in before.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's two issues here. I think, firstly, we should be sceptical of being frightened of some kind of Terminator scenario where we've got drones flying around, making their own decisions and doing things that we don't want them to do. However, drones with artificial intelligence, which is what we're increasingly talking about. We're less and less talking about essentially remote-controlled planes, but actually autonomous vehicles. They will often operate on a basis that you program a target or a mission for them, and then they will work out how to do that mission. And that may well include things that perhaps you hadn't expected. And as has been mentioned, there is the potential for bugs in systems. You know, things sometimes do wrong, or computers do behave sometimes in ways that we didn't expect. However, I also think it's worth bearing in mind that
there's a stop on that. That is really worrying. You've got a relatively heavy, very technological piece of equipment in the skies that could be subject to a bug.
What I was going to say was it's worth bearing in mind that planes have basically been able to fly themselves since the early 90s. You know, this isn't new technology. This isn't something that's just arrived. What we're talking about are the uses and the applications of it that is the new and interesting side of things. Well, so we've not come out of nowhere with this, but it is worth saying that what we need to make sure is that there is rigorous testing, and that these machines are tested at places like potentially West Wales Airport, to make sure that we fully understand how they operate, and that we can be as certain as possible, as certain as we are with any other technology that we put into the air or in other vehicles into which we put our lives, essentially, that we are as sure as possible that they won't malfunction.
Harry Rogers, you wanted to come in.
Yes, I did. Well, it's one thing programming vehicles to fly from A to B, right? But when you put artificial intelligence that is going to enable drones to be able to go on search and destroy missions, because there's no doubt in my mind that these programs that are being developed, whilst they have a civilian surveillance use, are going to be used in the theatre of war all around the world for vehicles to be able to seek out and destroy. And you know, it's one thing to say that we shouldn't be frightened of a Terminator scenario, but actually, you know, it's not too far away from that. Science fiction writers have been prefiguring all of this for quite a long time, and it does seem to me that as soon as you start to go down that road of artificial intelligence, then you are going down putting artificial intelligence into unmanned aerial vehicles and also unmanned other kinds of vehicles. For example, vehicles on the sea or vehicles on the land, which are being given the same kind of technological advances that you're talking about.
I would say that the greater danger is not of computer malfunction here, but of either human error or attempts to hijack these drones. There's also the government's use of them. You see, it's all very well when you to advocate the use of these things all the time that you've got a government in power that's going to use them for benign purposes. And that's why we need to ensure that there is correct regulation and sufficient regulation.
For all kinds of purposes.
Sure. Should we let Stephen have his point, Harry, and then we'll come back to you, Stephen Harris.
So, that human error and kind of negative, dangerous attacks on drones are probably something we should be more worried about. It's been demonstrated that it's relatively easy to fool drones into thinking they are somewhere where they're not, using a technique called GPS spoofing. And doing that, you can essentially hijack a drone. Now, if you're okay, this is potentially much worse for obviously military drones. And if you've got a video camera on a drone and that's it, there's probably not an awful lot you could do with it in terms of misusing it. Apart from annoying people, bringing it down in dangerous and creating dangerous situations. But I think that's more of an issue than perhaps the technology, the artificial intelligence technology, suddenly going haywire and trying to take over the world.
Robert Dewar, let's come to you now, because you're obviously a specialist on the safety issues of the drones. And what have you got to say from what you've heard already from Stephen Harris and Harry Rogers?
Well, one thing to point out is that, there tends to be a viewpoint, all software has bugs and we should worry about that. But we actually can do pretty well if we decide on appropriate regulation and requirements. We've never lost a life on a commercial aircraft due to a software implementation bug, because we use very strenuous certification procedures. So just in terms of that concern, I think we could address it if we have a mind to, but it delays deployment of these things. It increases their expense, and there's always there's some manufacturer and there's some police department that wants to get these in the air as soon as possible and as cheap as possible. So that's a tension that I think has to be dealt with. I would also point out there's another dimension of concern, which is these in the hands of the government, these build huge files of information, as does any kind of surveillance. But the drones, in particular, have the potential for gathering, more private information. Do we know, and do we put into place the means to protect that properly? And we have numerous incidents. They happen every week of security violations and massive breakdowns of software that just isn't handled in a safe way. And just that wealth of data, I think, is worrisome, especially as it's a CCTV camera on a public place is sort of a very well-defined thing. As you walk around the streets of London, you know that you're likely to be on camera nearly all the time. You might not like it, but you know about it. And and that's something you have to adapt to. And in any case, if you're on a public street, people could be watching you. So you can argue that the CCTV cameras are just an extension of societal surveillance that happens by people watching people anywhere, but not in their homes and not in their private places. And so that, I think, is the line that you have to be very careful with, is that once you start to gather what I think most people would consider to be more private information. For instance, I'm sure it's quite technologically possible to build a drone that listens to conversations in cars. And most people would consider that to be private. But yeah, I'm sure there's no problem in having a drone follow a car, and relatively straightforward. These cars are, typical cars are not protected against that kind of surveillance, to listen to a conversation.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for today's discussion, but thank you to all of my guests. Stephen Harris, senior reporter for The Engineer magazine. Harry Rogers is the local peace activist from Wales. And Robert Dewar is Emeritus Professor of Computer Science at New York University and President of Adacor, who provides software for commercial aviation and defence companies.